And welcome to the Reason in Theology show, doing a second stream here Tuesday evening. Welcome. Doing a show here on Orthodox iconography and art. I'm going to be joined by Father Patrick, who is an Eastern Orthodox priest contributor here at Reason in Theology, and William Albrecht, co-host, Roman Catholic, and our esteemed guest, Mr. Jonathan Pageau. I'm going to go ahead and bring him on here in just a moment, but let me read his bio first. Mr. Jonathan is a professional artist, writer, and public speaker, giving workshops and conferences all around North America. Through his YouTube channel and podcast, The Symbolic World, he also furthers the conversation on symbolism, meaning, and patterns in everything from movies to icons to social trends. And I also put a couple links to his personal blog and the symbolicworld.com there in the description, so y'all definitely check it out. But again, we're going to be discussing Orthodox art and iconography coming up next. Mr. Pageau, how are you?
Doing quite well. It's nice to meet everybody.
Nice to meet you as well. Welcome to the show. Father, how are you? William?
I'm well, thank you.
Doing well. Great to be here with all of you all.
Yeah, it's been a while. So, like I said, we're diving in here into the topic of Orthodox art and iconography. First, I want to ask you, Jonathan, how did you get into art and iconography? Is this just something that happened, as a child you discovered your talent, or was it maybe a little bit later on in life?
Well, I always thought I was going to be an artist from very young. And that's what I studied in school. I went and I did a bachelor's degree in painting at Concordia University here in Montreal. But I was at the time a Protestant, a Baptist. And there was a tension, let's say. There were several tensions that I discovered. One was a tension between contemporary art and Christianity in general, because contemporary art is extremely cynical and twice removed. It's always a comment on a comment on a comment. And it left me very uneasy. But there was also a conflict with my kind of Baptist upbringing and the desire to make visual art. It wasn't an explicit animosity towards art, but there was an implicit problem, let's say theological problem, that I was trying to deal with in school. And so this kind of double alienation led me into, I would say, a spiritual crisis. And there were other things going on as well, but all of that kind of spiritual crisis led me to the Orthodox Church. And part of that was discovering first medieval art in general, just this kind of universal language that had developed in the Christian tradition that kind of bubbled up. There aren't a lot of writings about it, but you can see that there was this universal way of describing certain images with variety as well. But there was always this way that you could have been in a church in Spain or in Syria, and you would have still have known what's going on in the images that you're seeing. And so discovering that powerful universal language, and at first kind of complaining that it didn't exist anymore, but then discovering it in the language of Eastern Orthodox iconography, that it was still alive and not just, let's say, the iconography per se, if you limit it to that, but this kind of liturgical dance between the images and the architecture and the hymnography, and how there's this kind of intertextuality of references with scripture and oral tradition. And so it really is this powerful kind of sacred language that I fell in love with. And it was one of the reasons that kind of brought me slowly towards becoming an icon carver.
So, and before your conversion, when you were a Protestant, was it pretty much one of those congregations that's just 4 whitewashed walls?
Yes, no not even a cross. Like we had a cross once that got put up for Easter, like for actual Easter, and then people after a few weeks like complained that it was still up and they had to take it down.
It's interesting because the iconoclasts, if I recall correctly, the one thing that they didn't oppose as far as images was the cross. Yeah, so it seems like some Protestants took it even further than the iconoclasts.
Yeah, well, it's Puritan theology, really, that kind of led into Baptist theology. Obviously, there's no pure theology of these groups anymore, but it's also because in Quebec, where I am, all the converts to Protestantism are converts from Catholicism. And so they're converting to something, but they're also reacting to something as well. So even like in our church, they had put like these bells, not real bells, but like sound of bells. And some people were super uneasy about the sound of bells. Like they really, even that they wanted to get rid of. So there is also a kind of reaction to Catholicism.
And I want to pull up a couple images here. I found this one on your website. And also I saw this one.
That's not me though.
that wasn't okay. I thought that one.
No, I really carved. This is Railenu. She's a Romanian iconographer. But I bought that image. You can see it. It's behind me. See right there?
Yes.
So I actually own that image. I bought it from her because I fell in love with it. It's such a powerful image.
I loved it. Now, is this one yours?
This is one of mine. This is I carve icons. So it's an icon carving in stone with semi-precious stone inserts and gold leaf. So yeah,
it's gorgeous. And since we're talking here about icons, tell us the difference between art and iconography. Is there a difference? Is it the same thing?
Well, it's a problem of definition. Let's say in the ancient sense of an art, let's say the way that the medievals understood art, which was the capacity to properly fit things together, right? In the sense that we understand as much we understand poetry to be an art, or even cheese making to be an art, like the capacity to properly fit the elements together. In that sense, iconography is definitely an art, really in the ancient sense. But in the modern sense, in the sense of a kind of spectator type of behavior, where you just stand and look at an image in this kind of aesthetic distance, then definitely icons are not that type of art. They're not the same kind of thing that you'd see in a gallery. They're more liturgical. They're participative, right? They're meant to engage you rather than just make you be a spectator.
Now, one thing that I've heard, and tell me if this is your experience as well, is that when you make an icon, it's a prayerful activity. It's done prayerfully. It's not just, simply making.
Sometimes, I mean,
is that your experience?
When you do it full time, there are some times when the making of an icon is not prayerful. Like if I'm married, I have kids, I have all the problems of like daily life. And so there are some moments in my life where making the icons has been extremely prayerful. And, you have these little moments of grace and epiphany while you're carving. And there are moments, if I just had a fight with my wife, but I still need to make these icons, it's my living. Then there's not a lot of prayerful thing. But it's surprising though, because there are, God uses us despite us. It's almost, there's something of the idea also even of the legitimacy of the sacrament, despite the behavior of the priest, let's say, which is that there are moments where someone has seen one of my icons and have said, oh, this is so touching. Like I really feel that God's grace is working through this image. And I'm thinking, I remember when I made that and there was no grace, like in my own heart, like I was angry or I was, whatever it was that was going on. So hopefully God washes over our own sinfulness, even in those moments.
But, even in those rough moments, I'm sure you still have some inspiration behind the art. Is that accurate? And if so, what really inspires you and motivates you when you do it?
Well, I really have a love of the traditional images. And so to me, it's really exciting to dive into that language. It's in Orthodox iconography, there's more what you would call a kind of canonicity. That is, because the images are extremely theological. Like, you can understand it that after the Seventh Ecumenical Council, because there was really a theological definition of the function of the icon in the church and of its relationship to the incarnation, then the images became very theological. And so the central images, let's say the images of the feasts, the images of Christ and the Mother of God, they're extremely typified, and you can't go next to them. Like, there's flexibility, but you need the elements to be there. And so because of that, it's a more rigorous language. But for me, the joy of discovering how powerful this language is, it's almost like this communal language that people developed and refined. And so once an image has kind of reached its perfection, it doesn't move a lot in terms of the elements in there. But then in those images, you find more than the singular genius of an artist. You find an entire language of a tradition that is embedded in these images, and not just the images, but how the images speak to each other. And so there's actually like an intertextuality. So elements that you find in some images, you re-find in other images, and this discussion of meaning is happening. And even like where the certain images are placed in the architecture is like this beautiful dance. And so that's really what inspires me, is really the actual tradition and how it reveals Christ in the world.
Now, in addition to carving icons, is it accurate to say you also do some two-dimensional drawings? Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I do. I make other type of art as well. I like to explore, like I'm using drawing to kind of explore, I would call like paraliturgical images, or kind of borderline liturgical images. And so like I even make t-shirts designs and stuff for people, usually something like angels or images of protection that would be worn more on the outside, because they have kind of that sense to them. And so they're not totally icons. They're kind of like paraliturgical images. I usually don't write an inscription on those images to not confuse people, so they don't think that it's the same as an icon you would use in the church or venerate or something. But yes, I do. So this would be like that what you showed there is a pattern.
And is that one that you did, by the way?
Yeah, that's one that I did. Yes. So that's an image that you can find on a t-shirt and everything. And so like for angels, it's interesting because they're not actual images of the angels. And so there's more flexibility there too. Like if you make an image of an angel, you're not representing, it's not a person, right? Angels don't actually have faces. They're symbolic, more or more kind of allegorical or analogical, rather than if you're making an image of St. Nicholas, for example, who's very typified. Like you recognize St. Nicholas by his, let's say his traits have been transmitted generation to generation. You can recognize St. Paul, St. Peter. There are some saints that are not as typified, but some saints are very typified, and you recognize them.
Now, in something like this image, it kind of reminds me almost like of a medieval illuminated manuscript.
Yeah.
Do you do stuff like that as well?
No. I mean, I really love illuminated manuscripts. And that image that you showed there, it's a more Western image. Like the image of St. Michael killing the dragon is more of a Western medieval image. It's less prominent in Orthodox churches. There's nothing wrong with it. It's acceptable. Sure. It's just something that was more prominent in like late medieval, early Gothic images. And if you look at the dragon that I drew, I made it look Scandinavian. So it looks like the head of a Scandinavian boat there with like all the knots and stuff in it.
That's a good point. I didn't think about that.
Yeah,
that's very true. I like that. Well, I have a lot more questions, but I do want to give William and Father a chance to ask theirs, and then I'll come in on the tail end and ask a few more. William, what kind of comments and questions do you have?
Thank you very much for having me here, Michael. Glad to be back. Glad to be here with Jonathan and with Father Patrick and yourself. Jonathan, really I was looking on the internet, your stuff looks great, fantastic. You do great work. You brought up earlier, you made a really good point of really modern day kind of Protestantism lacking images. I wonder, I sound like a fool asking, I'm pretty sure you're aware that many churches in Europe, a lot of them, like in Germany, really old Lutheran kind of churches, kind of retained a lot of those gorgeous stained glass images with windows with images and what have you. You made a really good point how later reactionary Protestantism has seemed to move further away from not only the reformers, but even ancient Christianity. Did all of this really help you, I guess, when you began digging deep? Did it help you turn towards orthodoxy, towards ancient Christianity, when you realized that kind of gradual moving away from the ancient faith?
No, definitely. But like I said, the crisis that brought me to orthodoxy was a deeper crisis. It was also about a certain arbitrariness to the Protestant story that I was hearing, like this idea that just, like, believe these things and then you're saved, but it didn't connect to, let's say, the structure of reality. It's like it's materialists who have a materialist worldview, and then on top of that they add the story about sacrifices and all this. Whereas what I discovered in the tradition and in the Orthodox faith, especially in certain fathers like Saint Gregory of Nyssa and Saint Maximus the Confessor, I really discovered a worldview that I could live in, like an entire metaphysics that I could inhabit. And that is really what I was ultimately looking for. And then in the images, you see that metaphysics or that image of reality portrayed. And so the structure of icons is really like the structure of the cosmos that is described in the early church fathers. And that is really something that is very profound. And so, yeah.
Yeah, very, very good. Really, really good point.
Oh.
So in Protestantism, you're able to hear me, right? Can you hear me okay? Okay, I'm a convert.
Yeah,
as well.
you had a little lag there, but you're okay now.
Okay, my bad. I'm a convert as well from Protestantism, so I recognize that kind of those kind of problems you find within Protestantism. They bothered me very much as well when I was on my journey towards which eventually became Catholicism. But you bring up really, really good points. I wonder, do you have a favorite icon that you particularly like to work on?
There are certain icons that I definitely like. I love the festal icons, like the icons of the Feast of Christ. I really love because there's so much. There's so many layers of meaning that can just be kind of peeled out of. And so one of my favorite icons is the icon of the Anastasis, which is the descent of Christ into Hades. It's just such a powerful image because there's something about it which is so cosmic and so amazing. So I would say that's probably one of my favorite images. But ultimately, my favorite image is the image of Christ in general. You know, just every time I have the chance to make the face of Christ, I'm humbled by that. And so there's something about that just the icon of, let's say, Christ Pantocrator is holding a book. And there's something about that image which I think that all of iconography is kind of folded into that one image, and so I really love that image.
I wonder, one thing that is I've always had it on my mind. I can't draw at all or do anything, any kind of amazing work that you do. By the way, you're very gifted, very, very blessed from God. I wonder, first off, have you ever worked on any kind of iconography of our Theotokos, of our Lady?
Yeah.
Has that at all brought you to a closer kind of love, a deeper love for Mary?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that in any moment where, let's say, in the moments where I'm not, like, if I'm not very spiritually attuned, and sometimes, sadly, my depth when I get into the icon is not there. But in general, when I'm more attuned spiritually, then whatever saint that I'm working on, I will kind of feel this rapprochement. I'll feel like I'm coming closer to the saint, and for sure with the Mother of God. But I mean, I think that for me, understanding the place of the Mother of God was part of my move towards orthodoxy, because there was an element missing, let's say, in the way that Protestants understood Christianity, the ark, the place, and you can understand that their whole iconoclasm, everything about the iconoclasm is because this refusal of the bottom part of the equation, of this capacity of God to kind of renew creation and to bring everything together and to manifest beauty and to manifest his presence in the world. And so that's why all the architecture has to go. Everything becomes arbitrary. Everything becomes whatever you want it to be. Whereas in discovering the place of the Mother of God as this container and as this vehicle for the revelation of God, then it brings you closer to everything else. Like all the rest of the tradition kind of comes together because you see that God reveals himself in these forms, really. Like it's not arbitrary. Like he fills the world up with his glory.
Yeah, it reminds me very much of the language of the great St. Augustine. Great point that you bring up there. I wonder, one thing that I've heard differing things from different individuals, from Catholics and from Orthodox. So I wonder, is it permissible to actually work or to do an icon of God the Father?
Well, I don't make icons of God the Father. You know, the appearance of the icon of God the Father is a very late medieval thing, you know, and so even in the West, God the Father was not represented until 13th, 14th, and very rarely already. And it's really in like the late Gothic and then early Renaissance that God the Father starts to be represented. And that happened in the Orthodox countries as well. Like I don't want to remove the blame on the Orthodox for doing that, but they always were trying to find ways to justify it. Like they would make images of God the Father, but then they'd write Lord Sabaoth next to it and say, well, it's a vision of Daniel. You know, it's like it's the vision of Daniel, so we can represent it. And so
I hear that very often. Yeah.
So they're always trying to be tricky about it. And I think that the fact that all of this type of elasticity in the tradition led to basically the destruction of icons. Like, you know, in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, there was almost no iconography being made. It was gone. It was destroyed. And so I think that in the renewal of iconography, there's a desire to trace back the mistakes that were made and then try not to make those same mistakes with respect to what happened. It's like, you know, I want to be careful, and there are miracle working icons that have an image of God the Father on them. And so we want to be careful not to be like crazy icon smashing iconoclasts. But I think it is wiser today to not have those images because they lead to theological confusion.
This is a really good point that you bring up. I've heard of that as well. I've never done deep research, but it sounds to me like you have. So that's a very good point. And I have frequently heard it brought up that people that argued for it being permissible bring up the vision of Daniel chapter 7, Ancient of Days and what have you. Really, really good points you bring up there. Now, I don't want to put you on the spot, but just let's say that curious. Let's say that I come up to you, Jonathan, and I'm a Protestant, and I tell you, well, Jonathan, from an Orthodox perspective, where in the Bible is it permissible to have any kind of, you know, graven image? Isn't it condemned in the very commandments? How would you reply to that?
Yeah, of course it's condemned. It's not totally condemned. That's really important because obviously there were images. The idea that there were no images in the temple is ridiculous. You just have to read the text and you see clearly there were images, and not just images of animals, but images of angels. Yeah. And so what I try to, everything in the scripture points to Christ. Everything. There's nothing in scripture that points to Christ. So the question is, if there is a commandment that says you're not allowed to represent things and use them, let's say, somehow, like to have them have importance, let's say, then how does that point to Christ? Yeah. And the answer is that it does, in fact, point to Christ. Christ is the answer to the second commandment. He is the resolution of the second commandment because God gave us an image. God gave us the image of himself in the person of Christ, and therefore to not represent Christ is to deny the incarnation. Yeah. And that's really the answer that the fathers gave, is that if you don't represent Christ, it means what? What does it mean? It means that you don't believe that Christ could be seen? It means that you don't believe that someone could point to that guy in Galilee and say, hey, where's God? And someone could point to that and say, there's God. You know, how crazy that sounds, but that's what we believe, right? That's what we believe. And so the importance of God manifesting his image in Christ, that's what the second commandment is ultimately pointing to. And we have to take that into account as we now worship God and understand that there has to be a place for images. And the Seventh Ecumenical Council is really a precision on how to avoid the problem of images while understanding the need for them because of the incarnation. And so that's what it says. It says we don't worship images, but we recognize that images are one of the vehicles by which God manifests himself, really. And so we don't worship the image, but we see in the image, something which leads us towards those higher images, towards the prototypes, which manifest them. And therefore, we can have this healthy relationship with images because Christ revealed God to us.
Jonathan, what an incredible reply. I almost got from your reply almost the word for word of the great Saint Basil the Great, where he notes how that a great honor goes to the prototype. Brother, I'm just totally blown away by your reply. Really, really great kind of stuff. Thank you very much. I enjoyed dialoguing with you. And if I have anything else in my mind that I want to pick your brain with, I'll do it in a bit. I want to pass it back over to my brother Michael, who I think is going to pass it to Father Patrick. Michael, you're on mute.
Are y'all able to hear me now? Okay, sorry, I have a couple mute buttons here. One of them was unmuted. The other one was still on mute. Sorry about that. Yeah, Father, I want to pass it over to you for a moment to ask your questions, and then I'll come on the tail end.
Thank you. Hello. You might know Aidan Hart, I think. Sort of fellow compatriot from New Zealand. Yes. Now, just a few more symbolic related questions I've got here. So I'll read them out a bit slowly because I'm involved. How do abstraction and symbolism and icons relate to deification in terms of a final spiritualization, your continuance of matter, the interior state of saints, and participation in God as in his light?
Yeah, well, it's a difficult question. I have to be totally honest with you. It's a fraught question. It's actually a question that is being hotly thought about and debated right now in kind of iconography, world, because there is a school or there's a side of the iconographers that talk about how the actual way that we represent in the icons, let's say with a certain simplification of the forms, with a certain stylization, and these flecks of light, let's say, that we use in the icons, this type of representation is a way to show the transformation of the saint. And I think that, for example, Aidan is definitely in that school, that we coming from Uspensky and Kontonglu, who are, let's say, the renewers of the tradition in the West. But there's a heavy fighting back right now of people who say that the idea that the style of the icon has some value or some meaning is debunked by several facts. One is that many miracle working icons are Western, like they're painted like Renaissance type images, and also it confuses it confuses like the spiritual and the physical together. And that's what some people are saying. I myself am probably more on the side of Aidan, and I believe that in the representation, so a good way to actually bridge the gap. There's a really good way is to talk about aestheticism, is to say that the images that we make in icons need to have an aesthetic quality, which is that just as the aesthetic will remove the externals and remove the frivolous, there in the icons we want to have that same approach where we remove distraction and we focus on a kind of centrality of form. And so in that aestheticism, that is in the manner in which we can maybe say that we see the transformation of the saint in this kind of focusing on the heart, we could say, focusing on the heart of forms and the heart of things. And I think that that's one of the formulations by George Cordis, who's a famous Greek painter right now. And I think that that's a good way to describe it without falling into a kind of esoteric spiritualism, right? To talk about how we're seeing, we're seeing the spiritual aspect of the saint. But if we talk about the heart and about asceticism, then we actually bridge the gap, because that is how it manifests itself as a kind of reining in of the passions and a reining in of the externals into the center. But in terms of the certain specific things, like the use of gold and the use of halos and those types of objects that we put in icons, and those are definitely to show the glory of the saint. And in that sense, you could say that they're a symbolic or an allegorical representation of the divine light in that sense, because they really are there like crowns. So they're there to manifest the glory of the saint.
Right, thank you. Yeah, one of the things touches me is, in a sense of the touch along the asceticism, is a sense of stillness in the icon. That the classical form of icon, unlike a lot of later Western art, is anything but passion or movement. It's a deliberate sense of stillness that, in a state of ascetics, calmness, quietness, is reflected through that abstraction and the stillness in the icon. And I think that's an important aspect of the way it's done. Right, now next question. Do you see a distinction between painted icons, relief icons, and statues? And what do you think of the benefits or limits of each?
Yeah. Well, I think for sure the fullest version of the icon is the color, is the painted icon. In this, not in the sense that one is better than the other, but in the sense that in a painted icon, you can have more meaning. There's more meaning that happens in a painted icon, because then the color is part of the actual, manifestation, and color has some importance. It's not as typified as some people think, but it definitely does have a function. The use of light and use of transparency, all of this type of use. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why painted icons became the central art of the church. And so I see it as a hierarchy. And so I believe that painted icons are really the central art of the tradition, and then carved icons would be more peripheral and would be used in places, on objects that would require use, on gospel covers, on crosses, crucifixes, all this type of stuff that would be carried around, processed. And then statuary never really developed, for sure, in the tradition, and it's been looked down upon in many places. But I honestly don't have a problem with statuary. I make statues for Catholic patrons. If an Orthodox patron asked me to make a statue, I would wonder why. Like I'd kind of ask and try to figure out, like, are you trying to provoke? Like, what are you doing? Because I don't believe also in provoking tradition just to provoke it. It just developed that way in the East, where statuary wasn't part of the tradition, and it was refused by several. Like, there are some important saints that have spoken against statuary, because their argument is, I think it was Saint Theodore. Who was it who said that? I forget the saint. That's horrible. There's a late saint who put together the not the Philokalia, but the canons of the councils. And he said, sorry?
Nicodemus Agiorite.
Yes, I think that's what it is. Yes. He said that statues cannot be used in the church because they're not images of something else, but they're the thing itself. And that was his argument. And so I don't know, like, that's the argument.
All right. Oh, interesting.
And Aidan wrote about that on the Orthodox Art Journal. People are interested. We do have a few articles on statuary and icons in the tradition.
Yeah, I remember actually in some of the very early writings there are mentions of statues and some miracle working ones right back in this sort of, you see this, you can see in there. So it's certainly something you can't push out altogether.
No, there are statues in the Orthodox Church. You don't, like, people who say there aren't, they're wrong. There are statues. There are statues in Greece. There's a miracle working statue of St. George in the Mediterranean. There are, in Russia, they have statues. There's certain saints that are represented only as statues. St. Nil Stolbensky is represented only as a statue. And so there are marginal versions of it, but we have to just understand it's a hierarchy. People who would want to use these exceptions as saying, well, it's okay, so we're going to fill our church with statues, is you're not doing things with the right reasons. Like, what is your reason? What do you want to accomplish? But also just saying that it's not Orthodox and it doesn't exist. Well, it's not true. It exists on the fringes. It exists on the margin. It's exceptions. There are places, and there are miracle working ones. So,
Yes. Now, next question is, given that the honor given to an icon passes through to its prototype, what do you think about the medium and context through which icons are presented? So what is the appropriate for veneration and honor of a saints presented in the icons?
What do you mean by medium? You mean by what's used?
Well, it's a whether you like you can put it on a wooden panel.
Yeah.
You can print it on a postcard, a stamp or something like this. So just
Right.
what is
well, I think there's a hierarchy. I see everything in hierarchies. I'm sorry. I think there's a hierarchy. I think that we need to be able to aim towards the best version of the icon, which is this version that was developed in the tradition as painted in with egg colors to make it very permanent, to make it last a very long time, to have it on a wooden panel for the same reasons. So all of these reasons were developed in the tradition, but it's like there are also miracle working icons that are just photocopies. Right? There really are. Like there are miracle working mirror streaming icons that are Xeroxes, basically. And so we have to be careful, like to still, it's like we can aim, it's almost like you could say, what's best, like a church in a basement or Hagia Sophia? Well, the answer is Hagia Sophia, but the sacrament is still valid in a church that's in a basement, right? So we can at once say that, yes, there's something we're aiming towards. Like there's a quality we're aiming towards, and there are reasons why we're aiming towards that quality, and still recognize the possibility of lower forms manifesting themselves, even though like there is a problem with mass production of icons. Like there's a real theological problem, because like just imagine like these images of Christ being printed out in China and like being shipped to Europe and then distributed all over the place and put on mass production on postcards and things that end up in the trash. And so it's like there's this problem of our throwaway culture and how we understand the sacred. And even though I wouldn't say that those aren't icons, I think that as a larger phenomena, it's definitely having an effect on our perception of what is sacred and how to interact with what is sacred.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing I was trying to draw out, in the sense that I think sometimes we're so used to putting icons on postcards, etc., that we forget that every image of it. And I think this is why the Xerox is as much miracle working as the painted one, because it's not the fact it's a nicely painted icon that makes it a miracle working. It's the fact it's the image of the saint that makes it a miracle working, and therefore we need to make sure we treat every image as equally venerable.
Yeah.
And the reason to put it on a particular material or medium is so that it is treated well.
Oh, yeah, but it becomes so complicated, Father. I mean, because even people who go down that line usually won't go as far as to talk about images of saints online, because I don't know what to do with that. Like, what do you do with streaming down Facebook and seeing an image of a saint and then seeing an ad for something that's slightly off key? Like, how do you deal with that? It's right now we're flooded, like we're so flooded with mismatched, chaotic images that it is affecting our psyche. That is for sure. But it's very difficult there is no easy solution out of this problem of the icon in terms of mass production. But, and it was told that it was going to happen. Like there's a theorist in the early 20th century. His name is Walter Benjamin, and he was like a Jewish communist in Europe. And he said, we need to go towards mass production of art. And he said, because we need to destroy the aura. That mass production will destroy the aura of art, will destroy its sacredness. And he knew right in the beginning of the 20th century what was going to happen. And now we live with the consequences of that.
Right. Okay, next question is, what do you think of the relation between Orthodox art and the inner spiritual life of a faithful in both the context of portable icons and also frescoes and mosaics in the churches, as well as what's been mentioned before, the design of the church itself, the location of the images in it, but actually even the structure of the interior of the church, the structure, even the exterior of the church, the whole effect that may have on the spiritual life of the faithful.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't put it into words. Like anybody who's been in a proper church that is decorated with frescoes is is completely transported, and I think that even someone who's an atheist or an agnostic would be hushed, to move into to walk into these amazing churches that are covered with images. And to me, it's really, that is the pinnacle of iconography. The pinnacle of iconography is really not the portable icon. The pinnacle of iconography is this grand symphony that we find in the churches, and this representation of the stories of Christ and of the saints and of the Bible, in the architectural space, as they reflect each other and they discuss with each other. And there's this, and the really good churches, they're all theologically placed. It's not 100% of a system. There are some guidelines, but they are theologically placed. You don't put anything anywhere. And there's a relationship between, let's say, that what type of image would you put on the Western Wall? Put an image of the falling asleep of the Mother of God. You put an image of the Last Judgment. You put an image of Saint Christopher. So what are these images that we put on the West? Are these images of the end, of death, of this transition? And then what are the images we put in the East? We put the images of Christ coming out of the Mother of God as her being this vehicle for the incarnation, or we put an image of Christ returning in glory and kind of revealing to us, the incarnation. And so that's just one, but all the images, not all, but most of the images in the church would have this kind of theological thinking in the way that they're represented.
Right. Yes. And what do you think? My personal thought as well, a lot about Orthodox churches, the dome, etc., and the size, is a sense of enclosing into the heart, which is sort of an interesting symbolism. A lot of Gothic architecture is reaching up into the sky, whereas a lot of Orthodox ones, it's actually sort of enclose you into the space, and it's like going into the heart, etc., and yet at the same time revealing the glory of heaven to you at the same.
Yeah. Well, the Orthodox Church is microcosm in the way that it's designed. So it's like a little reality, and it has heaven and earth, and so it's not as much, like you said, it's not as much pointing towards heaven rather than like participation in this cosmic story. So there definitely is a difference between the Gothic spire, let's say, which has its own kind of glory and its own kind of power to it, and the more, this dome on a square, which is more this incarnational model, let's say.
Right. And my last question is just sort of like touching on developing that actually a bit further. In what way do you think that there may or may not be an overall image or symbol of reality that the integration of art and style and use and church design and the appearance or structure may convey to the faithful? So you sort of answered that partly, but just sort of draw. Can
you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I didn't understand some of the words.
Okay, sorry. In what way do you think that there may or may not be an overall image or symbol of reality that the integration of art, style, and use in church design and appearance and its structure, the layout of the interior, the layout of the exterior, may convey to the faithful?
Yeah, I agree. I think that for sure, like there's no doubt about that. In terms of understanding the plenitude of the art, there really is this, it really is a kind of interpenetration of languages. And so it's not just that, if you, ancient liturgies, like some of the architecture, they're discovering that some of the church architecture is actually sound. And they design some churches to actually reflect certain sounds. And so as you're singing, the sound would bounce off certain walls and go into certain domes and then would create an effect. And so there's this whole microcosm within the way that the church was designed, as much the images as the architecture, as even the participation of the sound in the space, to really create this participative space where you get transported, you're transported into the kingdom of God. So I think that's really the ultimate purpose. It's hard to accomplish today. It's difficult, because there are so many constraints in terms of cost, in terms of being in a Western world with all the constraints that come with that. So it's difficult to get to that. Like my church is horrible. Like it's a horrible church. It's ugly and it's in a basement, and it has fluorescent lights, and it's monstrous. And so, but we can still dream, right? We can still dream of the best churches.
Yeah. Well, I suppose just as a sort of finish up on that, are you of a persuasion that while we have these basement churches and they are still a place, that there should be care? Because I see sometimes in the States, my reflecting is sometimes this sort of modernistic design of churches. And for myself personally, I struggle to see that sometimes they don't really capture that feel. So it's just not this, like, you can't just sort of put a modern building in and put icons in it or a weird dome. What do you think on those sort of thoughts?
No, I agree. There's a clash, and it's a very deep clash. It's a clash which is a clash of worldviews. And so it's not about being nostalgic. And I think that's one of the things that people will accuse us of is of being nostalgic. But there's something in modern architecture and there's something in modern art, which is an open hostility to Christianity. It's an open hostility to the Christian worldview. And so if you want to be able to adapt that to Christianity, you're going to have a hard time doing it. And there's also another aspect, which is that the extremity of style that was developed in modernism, like the desire to create buildings that stand out and call attention to themselves in their kind of stylistic decisions. It also means that they age very fast. And so you look at those churches from like the 40s, 50s, 60s, and you just want to cry. Like you just want to cry because, oh, that looked nice and shiny back then, but now it looks like dated, like my grandparents' shag rug in their living room. Now it just looks dated. So
I think we lost Father there, Father. Hey, there we go.
Throw a button.
Did you have a follow up there, Father?
No. I think I'll pass it back on to you now. He did answer my question well.
Yeah, so I was on PageauCarvings.com. Again, the link is there in the description, and I came across this. This really caught my eye. I don't have a high resolution picture of it, but I love this. So you're not only just doing icons, you also will do things on sacred vessels like this. For the chalice as well.
Once in a while, like those I don't make a lot of because they're complicated, because you need to have a silver lining, you need to have a sacred a precious metal inside, so you have to find someone who can make it and stuff. Like if someone wanted to get that today, I would say no.
Well, I was gonna say, you know what, Father, on your anniversary for your priestly ordination, maybe we'll commission Jonathan for that. Yeah, you have some excellent stuff on here. So, one final question that I want to ask, and then I want to get to a couple chat questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Those of us who maybe have less talent than you do, if we are interested in doing just some basic iconography, is there any tips that you could give us on how to get started? On
making icons, you mean?
Making icons, or sacred
well, the
images.
best is to find a teacher. You can't. It's very difficult. You can kind of figure it out on your own, but it's best not to. It's best to find someone who's learned and who knows the tradition. And I would say, like, the biggest advice I give to a lot of people who want to paint icons is that you need to learn to draw. Just learn to draw, because there are a lot of icons out there that, even if people even use patterns, like say traditional patterns, and will just trace the icon, you need to learn to draw, or else the image will just won't look right. And there's a lot, because of this desire. There is a desire sometimes to want to oppose, let's say, iconography to art, and want to see it as just this liturgical thing. And I think that's a dangerous direction, because then people will just accept anything. Like they will just accept really bad quality icons because they say, well, this is for God. Like, this is not to impress men. Like, this is for God. But it's the same. Like, you want to sing well in church, and you want your priest to pronounce to pronounce the words of the liturgy in a way that is understandable. And you also want your images to be beautiful and to kind of bring you in. And so it's not, I think it's important to actually learn the skill and not because we live in like a weird democratic culture. People just improvise themselves. And it's like all of a sudden someone puts up a website and they're an iconographer and their icons are horrible, but because they have media savvy, then they somehow all of a sudden like are teaching, and you're like, why are you teaching? Your icons are horrible. Like, how did that happen? Like, who blessed, like which bishop had blessed you to do this? And if you're Orthodox, like you need to, if you're going to do it professionally, you need to have some kind of blessing, like encouragement from your own church hierarchy. You can't just improvise yourself that way.
Now, there's a really good question here from Kyle. Well, there's a few of them. Let me start with Kyle's. Opinions on the Christ, the Pantocrator, particularly the one you see as my profile picture. What are your thoughts on this sacred icon?
I mean, that question, I don't know what that, it's not a question. It's like, what do you think of this icon? I mean, it's an amazing icon. It's one of the earliest images
do you
of Christ.
think that it is, representative of Christ? Because I've heard some say that this actually is, through a tradition, the actual image of Christ. What are your thoughts on that?
I've never heard that. I mean, it really is it's a 6th century image that is painted in the tradition of the Egyptian Fayum portraits. And so in Egypt, in the late Egyptian culture, there was one tradition in a certain area where they represented faces using encaustic, using wax as a medium, and these very kind of lively, powerful images that even use gold to kind of show a kind of glory, a crown, and they would have bigger eyes. And so that is part of the language which fed into some aspects of iconography. And so in this image, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing kind of a high point of that tradition. And you can imagine there were many other images like that before, but all these images have been destroyed because of iconoclasm. And so it really is this kind of culmination. And so there was a competition in the early church about how, not a competition, there was, let's say, a discussion in the images of how to represent Christ. And there was a type of representation which was more idealized. So you represent Christ as a beautiful young Apollo type figure, like a nice, kind of a philosopher looking figure in the Roman tradition. And then there was a tradition that was more to show him as a Nazarene, to show him as a guy with long hair and a long beard, like the Nazarenes, like it's described in Scripture. They didn't cut their hair and they didn't cut their beard. And then that tradition is the one that won out. And so this is the image that has been kind of preserved and kept as the image of Christ.
This one is from Zebi. Jonathan, have you studied iconography in other traditions, specifically Oriental Orthodoxy, Syriac, Coptic, Ethiopian, Armenian? Any similarities or differences with Eastern Orthodoxy here?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't studied officially, but I definitely have looked quite a bit at early Coptic imagery and also Ethiopic images. Like there's a wealth there that is very interesting. Early Syrian images have been extremely influential. Like even for the Byzantines, some of those Syrian gospels were like extremely influential for Byzantine art. And so a lot of that was lost, sadly, with the kind of takeover from Islam. But there are some early manuscripts and there's a lot of beautiful stuff there. And so there are differences for sure. But there are definitely more similarities than differences. That's probably the best way to see it.
This one is from Nick. What is the difference between an icon and an idol?
I mean, there are several differences. One is that an idol can be two things. Like an idol can be an image of a false god. We don't want any of those. And then it can be something that you see as the pinnacle. So it's like, you're worshiping the thing rather than, and so anything can be an idol, right? Anything can be an idol. Your car can be an idol. If you stop there, like if you don't see your car as a gift from God and as a tool that God has given you to serve him, then it can be an idol. And so the idea of the idol is that someone thinks that the image itself has power, And so, for example, like in the Old Testament, you see that happening where God tells Moses to make an image. He says, make this serpent, put it on a pole. And then through that image, God manifests himself and heals the Israelites. And then later in the tradition, the Israelites fetishize the image and see it as a god in itself. And then it's destroyed. And so that's the difference between an icon and an idol.
And one more here. What is the best way to learn about the Western medieval sacred art tradition?
I mean, we have that internet thing, it's not, everything is available. It's not that hard. Like, it's really not that hard. You can, you go to your local libraries. The way I did it, it was before the internet was like it is now, in the let's say early 2000s. I went to my local library. I went to the university library in Montreal, and I would go on a Saturday, and I would go to the section of medieval manuscripts, and I would just take 10 books and I put them on the table, and then I would just go through, and I would start to accumulate a vocabulary where I would start to see, oh wait, okay, so this is an image of this is the transfiguration. Okay, but here it's represented differently. Why? Like, what's different? What's the same? When I would just kind of create this bank of references, so that then you have a language. Like you just have to put the time in. Like that's really the way to go, in my opinion.
And William has one final question for you here. Let me pass it over to you, William.
Jonathan, I think you've been great. I've learned a ton, and I've had a lot of fun dialoguing with you as well. I wonder, are we able to, at the end of the day, say that within Eastern Orthodoxy and within Catholicism, that the way we treat icons would be virtually the same? Or do you, on your end, view perhaps any differences there? What are your thoughts on that?
There's definitely a difference. Pope Benedict, in his book on the liturgy, he said that the West never fully accepted the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And he was right to say that. One of the things that happened is that in the West, they didn't have iconoclasm. And so they never fought the images. And so icons were never attacked in the West, but for the same reason, they also never developed a theological justification and theological understanding of the role of images. And so because of that, it's ambiguous. And that ambiguity is one of the reasons why it's not clear, like what these images, what's their role? Like how do they participate in the liturgy? And so, for example, like you'll meet Catholics that are extremely comfortable with venerating images, that'll kiss images, that'll rub them, that it will have gestures of veneration. Then you'll meet Catholics that are extremely suspicious about venerating images. And so it's because there isn't a theological understanding of how to act and how they are sacred. Whereas in the Orthodox tradition, there's a clear distinction which happens, which is that we venerate, let's say, the means by which God reveals himself in the world, and then we worship God. And so in the same way that we kiss the icons, we kiss the gospel, we kiss each other, we kiss holy things, because we reckon, like in the same way that in the Old Testament, they would bow down before the altar or bow down before the Holy of Holies, but our worship is attributed to God.
Would you agree that, at least in my opinion, that perhaps maybe that suspicion, or maybe that because I do know people that would be, maybe kind of avoid doing those kind of venerating activities. In my opinion, I think a lot of that has to do with how Protestantism looks at Catholics as being idol worshippers, and them kind of, being really, kind of drawing back and wondering, am I going too far? Do you think any of that plays a role in venerating icons? The reason I think so is I had that issue when I came from Protestantism to Catholicism. Do you think that plays any part, perhaps, with some Catholics kind of drawing back when it comes to that kind of veneration?
It's possible, but I think it's also, the story is much bigger. Like it's a larger story. So the way to see it, for example, is to see that in the West, what happened was a kind of manifestation of extremes, like that really took over. And so you, like, for example, you have to understand that the Protestants, they were reacting to images of like naked God. They were reacting to like Michelangelo's huge Zeus-looking naked God floating in the air and surrounded by like teenage nymphs, and who is like touching Adam. Like that's what they were reacting to. And so it's like that's the difficulty, is that because there were these extremes, and so they were reacting to like Rubens' super eroticized images that are like this massive like flesh that is just like all these naked bodies, like, you know, in the church. Right. And so it's like, so you have to understand how this is, and so
different kinds of matters.
Types of images exist too.
Yeah.
Like, are you going to venerate that?
Right.
Like, are you going to venerate an image that is eroticized? Like, it's weird. And so it's like all this tension that kind of
different kinds of atmospheres is basically what
exactly. And so all of this kind of laid itself out and created these extremes of like extremely permissive, very almost eroticized art, and then extremely puritanical, like no art, no images, no nothing, because we're afraid of this other extreme. And so it's like that's the issue that I see in terms of like actual veneration. I think the biggest issue is that I think, let's say, yes, Protestantism, but also people feel like they don't have an answer. Because I have an answer, right? And the answer is Christ. Like, that's my answer to people who tell me don't venerate images. It's like, I can show you why Christ not only makes that possible, but makes it important, right? And so I think that people need to maybe, if the Seventh Ecumenical Council was more imbibed in the tradition, then I think people would have an answer. Like, they could say, I don't care what this person says. I know why this exists. Like, I really do know. And it's a theological, it's not a compromise. It's not we'll let the ignorant people do this because it's okay. No, this is a theological distinction. Like, it's a theological proposition.
Yeah, well, I would add to that by pointing out that the massive majority of Catholic churches and individuals I know do embrace the second Nicaea. They do embrace it, and they do so for theological reasons. I would add that. So, in my opinion, I believe those that are adverse to doing it are either people that have come from Protestantism as converts, or people that really have family members and they're worried, well, you know, maybe you think I'm taking it too far. I said from my own personal experience, having seen that. But I guess I had so many other questions, and I know we're running out of time, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. I know Father Patrick has one other thing that he does want to pick your brain on. I've greatly enjoyed dialoguing with you, and God bless you and your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you don't mind, the one other thing that's sort of come up during the conversation, which I find interesting, is that I've been to Westminster Cathedral. I Westminster or Winchester, and you actually look at the art inside when it's not covered over, and you realize that the images are exactly the same. Christ is actually painted in the same way, the Mother of God and the relation of John. They're just like you're an Eastern thing. But what's interesting about them is there is a slight stylistic difference. So the theme is the same. So what I want to pick your brain on a little bit is your thoughts on how important that keeping the context of a tradition, the types, etc., but also in each type being localized in a sort of sense of its style, so that you can sort of feel like this is the Russian art, this is my local art, yet it continues with the same theme, the same tradition as such.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think that happened almost naturally. Like it was just a natural, because in the ancient world, people lived in their communities and would have naturally made images that at some point would, let's say, manifest their own particularity, their own idiosyncrasy, their own ethos. And so that's why if you look at High Byzantine art and you look at Russian art, it's quite different. You know, the like you said, the themes are the same, but some of the emphasis and some of the stylistic decisions are different. And so I think that is definitely important. I think we have a problem. It's not a problem. Maybe it might be an opportunity, right now. Like for me, for example, like I live in North America. So all of that doesn't mean anything. Like it doesn't mean the same. That's for sure. Because here, Orthodoxy is Greeks and Russians and Romanian and Georgians and Serbians and all kind of in this bouillabaisse of like, and so because of that, there's a like my approach has really been to try to turn that problem into an opportunity, which is to try to create icons that take the best from the different styles and try to create a kind of synthesis. It's not a universal synthesis, but it is a synthetic, let's say a synthetic desire, let's say, or a synthetic approach. And so taking, like I said, let's say the best type of style of clothing that was developed in Byzantine, but the faces I find in Western medieval art were more peaceful and had a then I see in the Byzantine carved icons. And so trying to find the best place for creating these images. And it's hard because the internet makes everything like mosaic, right? It's like you can jump on Google Images from a 9th century fresco to a 13th century image in the other opposite ends of the world. So that affects our perception for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the problems of modern iconography is it's very hard to sometimes develop a local style without sort of your Greek, Russian, and stuff like that, without copying something and yet being local. One of the things I've thought about, and I wonder your last little questions is what about taking in? I felt like when in New Zealand you see the Maori art, and I thought actually there's a lot of stylization you can take from that and incorporate it into iconography. So but they have the whole theme of ancestors. This is icons of ancestors, but you just transform the subject matter, and you can even take some of their stylization, but present it in the theme within the tradition. What do you think about that? Maybe local Native American art, or
no? I think it's possible. I think one has to be careful because a lot of that was done. Like a lot of that was, let's say, done in the modern age, with evangelical purposes, and some of the results are not so good. Like, and so we need to do it subtly, I think, but it is possible because there is something a little absurd about going to the jungle in Congo and walking into a church from Thessaloniki. Like there is something like, and I've had that experience myself. But there's something like absurd about that. And so, but I think that one of the problems of our world is that we want everything to be fast and quick and happen. Whereas something like that would take like a few centuries to actually happen. Like it would just slowly happen. And then, from the Byzantine artists that went to Kiev and painted there, then, after 1 or 2 centuries, all of a sudden this local Russian kind of language develops. But we're all in fast forward now.
Thank you.
And, I really want to thank you for coming on. This was fascinating. I learned a lot. Go ahead and put in a plug for anything that you want to direct our viewers and listeners to. Of course, I have the symbolicworld.com and also pageaucarvings.com listed in the description. Anything else you would like to put in a plug for?
No, I mean, that's usually, if people want to hear more the way that I speak, then it's on my YouTube channel where I talk about these types of subjects, but I also spill out into all kinds of cultural commentary in terms of how these patterns, these let's say sacred patterns that we find in the Church Fathers also appear in the world. I'd want to warn people though, like if you want carving from me, I'm afraid that I've stopped taking commissions for at least a year because I have a 2-year waiting list and I need to figure something out. So sadly, don't write me to ask for a commission because I'm either will not answer or will just say I'm sorry. So,
but I'm sure people could still support you and donate to you if they're willing.
Well, there is a way, like people. Yeah. I have a carving Patreon project which is there to kind of make my art better, so people can look into that. And every year I send prints to people. And I send drawings. Drawings are easier, so people can get drawings, prints, and experimental carving. Because I have a workshop that I work with an assistant to create new experimental carvings of ornaments and mosaics, mix of carving and mosaics. And so people can check that out as well. And if they want to support me, that's a good place to do it for sure.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you for coming on. And Father and William, I appreciate y'all being here as well.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, once again, this was excellent. Thank you all for coming. And everybody, thank you for watching. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. And, of course, share this on your social media. And if you would like to support us here at Reason and Theology, definitely check out patreon.com/Reason and Theology. Till next time, God bless.